Hey, welcome back. We're in part 4 of Sometimes It Takes a Mountain. We are talking about resolutions for 2018 and how most of us are at this point thinking about how we're going to be better Christians or better at Christianity the year than we were last year. If you remember, last week we talked about the story of Jonah and the whale, and we talked about the two different stories about storms on the Sea of Galilee. But we focused on these things in a different way than perhaps is traditionally taught when these are discussed in sermons. But we talked about how with Jonah, we had several different takeaways. We focused most of our discussion on chapter 1. We talked about how when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing as a Christian and you disobey God and you're running away from Him, one of the main takeaways was you can run, but you can't hide from God. It's not like you can flee from the presence of the Lord. We also talked about how disobedience can have unintended consequences. We talked about collateral damage and how sometimes the circumstances that we create because of our disobedience forces other people to make choices and decisions which may affect them in a negative way. We also talked about how submitting to God when He brings a storm to get your attention, to get you to turn back to Him. We talked about how submitting in the midst of the storm sometimes can lead others to Christ. And we saw the sailors in the story of Jonah going from fear, which was just simply fear of the storm, to exceeding fear, and eventually to the fear of the Lord. And they submitted to Him, and they vowed vows and made sacrifices to Him. We also talked about how submitting to God in the storm and being willing to pay the price of your disobedience brings you back into right fellowship with God, who will either save you from the storm by calming the storm, or perhaps hold you close and protect you while the storm plays itself out. So those were the main takeaways from our story with Jonah. But then we also went to the lessons, or to the story of the Seas of Galilee, and we had a couple of lessons that we could draw from those. One is, and we're taking this mostly from Peter's behavior, of course. When we find ourselves in the storm and we decide that it's time to become obedient and to turn back to God, it's important to ignore the storm. It's important to do what Peter did, which was to look for the Lord in the darkness, to find Jesus there, and to quit fighting God. We talked about how sailors have two choices in the midst of a real storm that endangers them. One is to drop their sails and just run headlong with the wind, or they can drop the anchor, drop their sails, drop the anchor, and then head into the wind and trust the anchor will hold and it will keep them safe. And we talked about Hebrews 6, where Paul talks about this hope that we have as the anchor of our soul, which really is God's faithfulness and the absolute certainty that God will fulfill His promises, and the certainty of the oath that He made that He would fulfill those promises as well. And I ended up last week by going back to Jonah chapter 2, and we looked at the prayer that he offered up once he was inside the belly of the whale. And we put chapter 2, verses 4, 6, and 9 together, which if you read them together says this: "Yet I will look again to your holy temple. Let my ruined life be restored. I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. My salvation is of the Lord." And I ended last week's lesson by suggesting that as we head into 2018, that we collectively need to take our resolutions and our vows to God to be better at being Christians than we were last year. We have to take those resolutions as seriously as God takes His vows and His responsibilities. Now, let's talk about the final contingency plan, because up to now we've been talking about how God is ready and willing to work with you, like it's your move. But we also talked about mountains and how they represent obstacles and challenges to our capacity. These are contingency plans, things that God allows in our lives to turn us back towards Him. You remember God's question, what's it going to take to get a hold of you? Sometimes it takes a mountain, sometimes a stormy sea, sometimes it takes a desert to get a hold of me, to quote a song that we've been singing in our Tampa fellowship lately. Now, a lot of times we think that these mountains and these storms and these deserts in our lives are all about us. And that's true. I think the primary purpose that God allows these things in our lives is to get us to draw near to him, to instill reverence, to teach obedience so that we may not sin, to paraphrase Moses in Exodus chapter 20. But as we saw in Jonah's story, both his disobedience and his obedience in the midst of the storm had an impact on other people. And the same is true of the main desert story in the Old Testament, which is, of course, Kadesh Barnea, where the Jews refused to go into the promised land once God brought them there. But before we get to the wandering in the wilderness, we have to make a stop first in a place called Pi Hahiroth. I want you to take your Bibles and go to Exodus chapter 14 for me. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the 7 weeks between when the Jews came out of Egypt and when they actually ended up at Mount Sinai. It took them 7 weeks to get there, and that, of course, in the biblical feast day calendar is the time frame between Passover and Pentecost. So Exodus 14, verse 1 says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." And they did so. Now, this is, of course, after Pharaoh had let them out of the city, and they, went with treasures and supplies and money. The Egyptians were quite glad to see them go. But then they come up to this place called Pi Hahiroth, and they're hemmed in by the wilderness and by the Red Sea. Now, we're not at the desert part of the story yet, but there's something here in these early verses which is significant. Moses tells us that part of God's motivation in hardening Pharaoh's heart to cause him to pursue the Jews is that God himself will gain honor over Pharaoh and his army. Go back and read verse 4 again. It says, "Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." And they did so. So if God's intent was to gain honor over Pharaoh and his army, and that the Egyptians may know that the Lord, when he says that he's going to gain honor over Pharaoh, honor in whose eyes? Well, it could be either Pharaoh and the Egyptians, like, hey, I decimated you, therefore I am greater than you are. It could be honor in the eyes of the Jews. Oh my gosh, look at what God did to the Egyptians, to the army. Or it could be both, which is actually what is accurate and certainly most likely. Up to this point, the only real authority that this particular generation of Jews had known was Pharaoh. It was the authority of the whip. It's likely that the destruction of the army in the Red Sea was designed to primarily develop the fear of the Lord in the Jewish people, as this generation came out basically as a fledgling or an infant nation. But not only was it primarily designed to instill fear of the Lord in the Jews, it was secondarily designed to instill fear in the eyes of those who were watching. And it wasn't just the Egyptians that were watching. Now, we know that based on what we've already seen, we know that God's pattern is to show his power and his glory, to wow his people, if you will, with displays of a spectacular nature, like the thunder and the lightning and the fire and the smoke on top of Mount Sinai, which happens about 7 weeks after this event that we're talking about right now. But can we say that God did these things to instill or to impress his glory on unbelievers? And the answer is yes, sure we can. And just for a moment, I want you to go to Joshua chapter 8, but we're going to be coming right back to Exodus. Joshua chapter 2, verse 8, not chapter 8. Joshua 2:8 is, of course, the story of Rahab. This is after God brings the Jews to the Jordan, and this is after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. This is quite a while after the story that we're talking about right now and today. This is after Rahab had diverted the king's soldiers by telling them that the two Jewish spies were out and had headed towards the Jordan to the fords. So Joshua 2 verse 8 says, "Now before they lay down," and these are the two spies that she had hidden from the soldiers of the king in Jericho. "Before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, 'I know that the Lord has given you the land.' And note this, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted, neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." And that language, to me, sounds an awful lot like Jonah. Jonah said, "I am a Hebrew. I follow the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land." And we see Rahab making a very similar confession. Now, of course, Jonah's story happens much later in Jewish history, but it sounds like the sailors too who threw Jonah overboard, where they were moved from fear to exceeding or intense fear to the fear of the Lord. Now, go back to Exodus 14 just to make my point. This statement from Exodus 14:4, where he says, God says, "I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." This is repeated in verses 13, 17, and 18. Now, verse 13 is a little bit of an oblique reference, but it focuses on the same idea. Let's start in chapter 14, verse 10. "And when Pharaoh drew near," this is after he made the decision to go ahead and pursue them. It's like he came to his senses and said, "What am I doing letting these people go? I'm going to go and we're going to capture them and bring them back." "When Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, 'Because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness.'" Well, living in Egypt under bondage was certain death and a miserable life, but I guess they preferred that to what they saw coming with Pharaoh's army, with literally hundreds of chariots. "And Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid.'" You can almost hear his frustration with these people. "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever." This is talking about God gaining glory over Pharaoh and over his army. "The Lord will fight with you or for you, and you shall hold your peace." In other words, he's saying, listen, shut up. God's going to take care of this. You need to trust him. "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them.'" And here's the next repetition. "So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Now, this part of the story is pretty well known, right? Moses parts the Red Sea, the people escape on dry land. Skip down to verse 28. "Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." Now, I want you to note two things and highlight these if that's your tendency. Note that in verse 30, when it said the Lord saved Israel that day, I want you to highlight that and perhaps write the word safety in the margins. And then highlighted verse 31, so the people feared the Lord, right? God's intent in doing what he did with the Red Sea was not just to keep his people moving forward towards Mount Sinai, where he was going to make them a nation by giving them the law. It was to instill fear and reverence in the Egyptians. But the result of what the people saw, the Jewish people saw, when the Red Sea closed in and consumed the Pharaoh, not the Pharaoh, but the Pharaoh's army, was that the people feared the Lord. So we see both. We see the Egyptians fearing the Lord and the people fearing the Lord because God had gained honor over Pharaoh and over his army. We don't have any other references that I'm aware of about how the Egyptians reacted to all of this after the fact. But we do have that story of Rahab and her confession that everyone had heard what the Lord had done. And her story was 40 years later. So it certainly had an amazing impact on those who were watching what God was doing. And as we head towards the story about wandering in the desert, God used the Red Sea to deliver his people in this spectacular way that left little room for doubt about who he is and what he can do. But there really was a little doubt because, of course, we see later people complaining continue to play. Even at this point, with everything that the people had seen and experienced directly, their faith in God was not complete. Now, what God is doing here is he's cementing his reputation among both the Jews and among the Gentiles. And as they found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the army, they cry out to God, have you brought us out to the desert to die? And so with this story, we see God's demonstration of deliverance. We see his demonstration of protection, or to say it another way, safety, as I asked you to put in your Bible's margin. Now think of it this way. If you're going to abandon the only life that you've ever known, just on a promise, like stories of a promise, isn't it important for you to begin that journey and that relationship, trusting the authority that you're going to submit to has the ability to keep you safe, especially if there's imminent danger, like an army of chariots bearing down on you? Now go to Exodus 15:11. Most of chapter 15 is a song that the people sang after God let the Red Sea come back and consume the army, where the people are extolling God's virtues. In verse 11, Exodus 15:11, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You in your mercy had led forth the people to whom you have redeemed. You have guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. The people will hear and be afraid. Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia. Now, notice all of these statements about how the world will react to what God had done. The people will hear and be afraid. Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom will be dismayed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling will take hold of them. All the inhabitants of Canaan will melt away. Fear and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as stone. Till your people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. Just like Jonah, when he found himself not drowning, found himself in the belly of the whale, still alive, he said, I will turn back to your holy mountain. He praised God as well, and he recommitted himself. And we see the Jewish people doing the same thing. So the Jews sing the song, and then Moses continues to move the crowd further into the wilderness. Skip down to verse 22 there. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. and said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, so they camped there by the water. Now, there's actually a lot of stuff there. First of all, before they crossed the Red Sea, the Jews cried for safety, and God gave it to them in this miraculous way. Now they cry out in thirst, what shall we drink? And God once again provides in a spectacular and a miraculous way. But this time he brings some conditions. In verse 26, he says, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. God started by moving them to fear and reverence. They feared him when they saw the bodies of the Egyptian soldiers dead on the seashore. Now he's beginning to put conditions to begin to move them towards obedience, which is what we've really been talking about all the time. But he's doing it by is he doing it by offering a blessing for obedience? And the answer is no, because that comes later. He starts out by saying, obey me, and I won't bring the plagues on you. Now, this is how we parent. Most people parent very, very young children, especially when it comes to things that can harm them, things that little children don't see and they don't understand. The world is a very dangerous place for a 2-year-old who wants to chase a ball into a busy street with lots of traffic. The promised land was never going to be a free gift to the Jews without them having to fight for it. But they had to learn reverence and obedience. They had to learn to avoid the cursing and God's judgment before they could even be motivated by something as simple but profound as the blessing. So God first provides safety in the context of imminent danger with the army bearing down on them, and then he provides water for their thirst. But, of course, that's not all that he does. Now go to Exodus 16, verse 1. We're several weeks later now. We're not quite to Mount Sinai, but we're getting close. Exodus 16 says, they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. Here we go again. And the children of Israel said, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, you'd think that they would have figured it out by now, right? God took care of the army. He healed bitter water so that you could have something fresh to drink. Now you're hungry and you think you're going to die? It's like Jesus when he said to the disciples in the Sea of Galilee, "O ye of little faith." What God does here in chapter 16 is he provides quail for them at night and manna in the morning. This is the first time that we see manna showing up, and they will continue to eat that for 40 years. And he provides enough for all people to eat and to be full. He satisfies their hunger and their need. But I want you to note the progression. Again, they cry for safety and God delivers them through the Red Sea. Then they cry out due to thirst, and God heals the water and brings them to 12 wells and 70 palm trees. Then they cry out due to hunger, and God gives them quail and manna, enough for everyone to eat and be full. Now, we know that you can survive weeks without food. You can survive a few days without water. You're not going to survive hardly at all once imminent danger arrives. What God is doing here is he's proving to the Jews time after time after time, and this is even before he gives them the law on Mount Sinai, he's proving to the Jews that he cares for them, that he will protect them, that he will provide everything that they need if they will simply trust him and obey him. In chapter 15, God said, "Obey my words and you won't die of plagues." Now here in verse 4, he tests them again by placing restrictions on the food supply. He says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." He wanted to see if they would trust him enough to take only what he told them, or whether they would start to hoard it because they weren't sure what was going to happen after this. Now, here's what I get from this personally. If I won't stop complaining and obey God when he's meeting my basic needs, for safety, food, and water, what makes me think that I'm going to obey him when I have more than I need? Moses would later save this generation in Deuteronomy, I think it's 32. He says, but Jeshurun grew fat and thick. That's a nickname for Israel, the one having been alive. He said, you grew fat and thick. You kicked. You're obese, he said. And then he says that they forsook God and scorned the rock of their salvation. It's a pretty heavy charge to bring down on people that had been tended and cared for so diligently and so clearly. It's human nature to ignore God until things get hard. And then when the mountain becomes a plain, or he lifts you up over it, when the stormy sea calms, or he comforts you through it, when the dry desert becomes a land of milk and honey, it's easy to forget who brought you through all of that. It's human nature. And even though, even while we're going through it, we tend to try to do things our own way, don't we? And that's nothing new, of course. Again, that tends to be human nature. So go for me to verse 19. Now God had given the people only 2 rules for the food. He said, take only what you need and leave nothing until morning. He wanted to make sure that they weren't hoarding things and keeping things aside just in case God didn't come through for them. Exodus 16 verse 16 says, "This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's needs, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons let every man take for those who are in his tent." Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. Now, this wasn't actually direct disobedience. I think that they just made a mistake, and who can blame them? Because who knows what an omer is? Now, of course, I'm being facetious. An omer, is about 1/2 to 3/4 of a gallon, or 2 to 3 pounds of something in dry weight. But nevertheless, in this particular instance where God said, take an omer for every person, what if you got like 15 people and you don't have an omer cup that actually measures it out? So some people took less than they needed. Some people accidentally took more. And I say accidentally because what God does here is he shows us how he handles his people when we make honest mistakes while we're trying to do his will. He covers for us. And he explains in verse 18, he said, so when they measured, and these are the people who some took more and some took less, he said, so when they measured it by omers, he who had gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's needs. So when we are trying to do our best, we have good intentions, and we're really sinning, if you will, out of ignorance, God has a lot of grace for that. So when we are making vows about being better Christians, and we continue to do things that we perhaps don't understand fully, are disobedient or distasteful to God, I believe that he has great compassion for us in those circumstances, and he covers us in those. It's when we disobey directly, when we know the difference, that the story changes. If you remember back when we did the Narrow Path series, I mentioned that mercy only comes to the obedient. only comes to the obedient. In verse 19, we see a different story. And Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it till morning." Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. They didn't eat the whole, like they rationed themselves, hoping to have some stuff left over again, just in case God didn't come through. Yet he had consumed the army of the pharaohs. He had gained honor over them. They saw the dead bodies littering the shore of the Red Sea. They had water to drink. They were safe. They had water. They had food. They really didn't have anything to worry about. So he says, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them, so they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourself all that remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up till morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. So in one context, having something left over was bad. In another context, when it is part of how God wants you to behave, having stuff left over is good. Now, I have a note in my Bible, and I don't know if it was my original thought or something somebody else said that I thought, well, that really captures the idea, and I wrote it down. But I have a note here with these 2 verses with verse 20, where it talks about how in a disobedient fashion, things that we do bred worms and stank, like in this story. And then verse 24, where when God said it's okay to leave something over, that it actually didn't stink. It was great. And my note says this: our way decays and God's way stays. And that's a rule, right? That's just the way it is. When we try to do things in our own will, within our own will, or do what God asks us to do in our way and not his way, that stinks. I mean, it's got worms, it's decaying. But if we do things that God asked us to do in the manner in which he asks us, this is where we have fruit. This is the stuff that stays and the stuff that sticks. Now, if we go back to our wilderness progression, God has so far demonstrated his willingness to provide safety, his willingness to provide water and food, but he, along the way, he's also asked them for reverence and obedience. Notice now he's beginning to put conditions and rules to see if they were going to obey him. He puts restrictions on them and how they are to use the blessings of water and food that he gives them. But he demonstrates mercy for honest mistakes, but consequences for direct disobedience. And I want to reconsider the rescue through the Red Sea. And I want you to think that the rescue associated with the Red Sea was a completely passive victory. The people didn't do anything, right? God opened the waters, the people escaped, and God closed the waters. God did all the work. The people just reaped the rewards, which was the safety on the other side. But now, as they make their way from the wilderness of sin towards Sinai, they come to a place called Rephidim. And once again, they cry out for water, same thing. And once again, God provides water in a miraculous way. He tells Moses to strike a rock, and he does, and water flows from it. But then they're attacked by Amalek and his army. And now this time they're out in the middle of the desert. There is no Red Sea to part. There is no way of escape. This time God asks something different of them. 2 events where they were in imminent danger, where an army was bearing down on them. But this time again, no room for escape. What God does different here is he asks his people to stand and fight for their own survival. But of course, he doesn't allow them to do that all by themselves, right? And what God is asking them to do, it's one of those mountains that we've been talking about, is something that these people would have looked at and said, this is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. We're not warriors. We're not soldiers. We're brick makers. What do we know about fighting? We're herders and farmers. This was an insurmountable obstacle that they had to completely trust God. Now, very interestingly, there's zero commentary here from Moses as he writes this story about how the people responded. When God said, I want you to fight, there's no reaction from the people. Well, I'm sure they reacted. But that wasn't the point of the story. It doesn't say that they complained. It doesn't say anything else. But given their history, I imagine that they probably said something like, I knew it. You brought us out here to die by the sword. It wasn't thirst. It wasn't hunger. We're just going to get slaughtered. But what Moses simply records is that he spoke to Joshua. And this is the first time Joshua shows up in the biblical narrative. And he sends them to war. He said, pick some men and go fight. And then the focus turns to what Moses did. There's hardly any description of what Joshua did. It doesn't tell us who he chose. It doesn't tell us how many people he chose, what implements of war he used. The focus in the story turns to Moses. Exodus 17, verse 8. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of my God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called its name, the Lord is my banner. For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, the picture that we see here is that when the prophet of God stands for his people and they're obedient, the people prevail. But we also see that, prophets and leaders can get tired. It's not easy to stand in the gap for other people, especially when they complain and they're disobedient. Leaders and prophets oftentimes need others to step in and to hold them up so that they can continue doing God's work. What God is showing his people here with this story is twofold. First is, hey, if you want to survive and inherit the promised land, you're going to have to fight for it. If you want to overcome your mountains, and I'm talking to you guys, if you want to overcome your mountains, those crazy situations that you find yourself in, the stormy seas that are threatening to drown you, the dry desert where you have no provision or safety, if you want to overcome those things, you got to fight for it. So this coming year, as we go through and we start talking about being better Christians, what are you willing to fight for? Are you just going to sit back and expect God to give you a passive victory like he did with the Jews in the Red Sea? Or are you going to be like Joshua and his men, and you're going to get out there and you're going to fight with God on your side, with godly leaders leading you and taking care of you and interceding for you? Sometimes the victory comes when the faithful people around you intercede on your behalf. And this is where prayer and sharing each other's burdens becomes critical within our fellowship. So that's the first thing. The second thing that God did with this desert event and story was that, understanding that leaders need support and leaders need assistance. Aaron, of course, became the high priest. Hur, this is the first time he's mentioned. He's apparently an assistant of some sort. There are 4 or 5 people in the Old Testament that are named Hur. This is most likely the son of Caleb, or one of the sons of Caleb. We get that from 1 Chronicles chapter 2. But this is very much like an early hierarchy, isn't it? Moses intercedes as the Jews do battle. He tires and his assistants step in to support him. And interestingly, he sits on a rock. Now, I can't tell if the symbolism here is intentional, but we know that Paul said that the rock that Moses struck from which water flowed, that represented Jesus. He called it the spiritual rock. It was this rock that followed them all the time. Not that the rock grew legs and walked around, right? That's not what that means. But what I see in this story, what I see in this image of Moses up on the hill, sitting on a rock with his arms uplifted towards heaven, holding the staff of God in his hand with Aaron and Hur supporting him. I see that the leader's not trying to do it alone, that he is interceding for the Jews in times of dire need. So the hierarchy goes like this, right? You got the rock, you got the prophet, you have the high priest, and an assistant. And again, it sounds like a very early hierarchy for this fledgling nation. God's message to the people in the story is fight for what you want. Fight like your lives depend on it. And if you do that, I'm going to support you. And your leaders will intercede for you. And together, there's nothing that I will ask you to do that you can't accomplish. And that sounds an awful lot like what we read earlier in our study. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. All the things that God calls me to do. So unlike the passive victory over the Egyptians, the victory over the Amalekites was both active and it was cooperative, which I think was an important early lesson for him. And it's an important lesson for us that you can't go through 2018 alone. There's a reason why we're not to forsake the assembling together. And there's a reason why we are called to intercede in prayer and share one another's burdens, because some of the battles we have to fight are too big for us. But they're not too big for all of us, and they're not too big for all of us who stand together, united, submissive, reverent, and obedient to God. Now, finally, go to chapter 18. This is where Moses meets Jethro, his father-in-law, who was, of course, the high priest of Midian. So Exodus 18, verse 19, Jethro comes in and says, hey, heard you left Egypt. Great, good job. He sees how weary he is and how the people are constantly coming to him to settle disputes and to get counsel. So Jethro says, listen, I need to give you some wisdom here. So verse 19 says, listen now to my voice. This is Jethro talking. I will give you counsel and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden for you. With you. If you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said, and Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over people, rulers of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Here's a more formal hierarchy than what we saw with Moses sitting on the hill, raising his hands while Joshua and the Israelites fought against Amalek. Now, what did Jethro say? He said this. He said, stand before God for the people. Stand for the people. Teach them statutes. Teach them how they must walk and what they must do to be obedient. Select men who are able to judge, who fear God, who love truth, and let them judge the easy stuff. In the 7 weeks since the Jews left Egypt, This is what God did in the wilderness so far, and they're not even to Mount Sinai. They're very, very close. He gained honor in their eyes over Pharaoh, causing them to revere him. He provided safety in the face of imminent danger. He provided food and water, their basic survival needs. He began to give them conditions to test them, to see whether or not they were to follow his rules. And when they made honest mistakes, he showed them mercy. But when they were outrightly disobedient, he brought consequences. He gave them victory when they were ill-equipped to fight for themselves. He showed them what true leadership looked like, founded on the rock, with leaders supporting each other to intercede for the people. And finally, Jethro, he showed them an early system of wisdom and justice that was meted out through a hierarchy of leadership that began with Moses and was predominantly carried out by able men who feared God, hated covetousness, and loved the truth. Now, how about you and your spiritual resolutions for 2018? We're going to end with this. Has God gotten your attention yet? Has he moved you to reverence and obedience? Has he not provided for your safety, for your survival, your basic needs, food, shelter, clothing? Have you seen his mercy when you've made honest mistakes, but have you also felt the sting of consequences when you did stuff you knew was wrong? Has he not already given you some victories over the mountains and stormy seas? Has he not fought alongside you? Have your brothers and sisters not lifted you up in prayer or interceded for you? Has he not provided you a way to walk in godly wisdom and not the wisdom of the world? Has he not proven himself to be a fair and merciful judge? Has he not given you everything that you need to be an overcomer? And the answer is yes to all of those. He's shown himself to be faithful and true. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. Until next week, we'll meet again. We'll talk about the lessons of Kadesh Barnea. I pray that God blesses you in 2018, that he is more than ever sovereign in your eyes, and that you enjoy the abundance of his blessings because you have been moved to reverence and obedience, so that you too hate covetousness and love the truth. God bless you, and we'll talk to you next week.